Ma'am, maybe try speaking proper English before booking business class. The sentence landed sharp and careless, cutting through the low hum of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls. And for a moment, the entire check-in line seemed to pause, like the air itself had tightened around the words. A few people glanced up from their phones. Others shifted their weight, pretending not to listen but listening anyway, because humiliation has a way of drawing quiet attention. And at the center of it stood Naomi Carter, her hand resting lightly on the worn handle of a navy suitcase with a scuffed corner, her coat simple, slightly creased from travel, her posture steady, composed, as if the comment hadn't reached her at all, though it had, because nothing like that ever really misses. Across the counter, Ethan Cole leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who believed he understood exactly who belonged where, his badge catching the overhead fluorescent lights, his fingers tapping lazily against the keyboard as he gave a small, dismissive smile, the kind that didn't ask for permission to judge. Naomi blinked once, slowly, her eyes moving past him for a brief second, taking in the terminal beyond, the glass walls reflecting early morning light, the faint echo of an announcement calling a delayed flight to Chicago, the scent of coffee drifting from a kiosk 30 feet away, grounding the moment in something real and ordinary. And then she returned her gaze to him, not defensive, not offended, just present. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying a soft accent that lingered on certain vowels but never stumbled. "Could you check the reservation one more time?" And there was no challenge in her tone, no edge, just a quiet request that somehow made the silence around them feel heavier. Ethan let out a short laugh, louder than necessary, glancing sideways at a coworker who smirked without looking up, and then back at Naomi as if the situation amused him more than it should have. "I already checked," he replied, dragging the words slightly. "And like I said, there's nothing under that name. Maybe try spelling it correctly next time." And the way he said it, casual, dismissive, carried an assumption that settled in the space between them. Naomi didn't move, her fingers tightening just slightly around the suitcase handle, not in anger but in control, her breathing even, her expression unchanged, and for a moment, the reflection of the overhead lights caught in her eyes, revealing something deeper than the situation in front of her, something observant, almost analytical, as if she were noting not just what was said, but how, and why, and who else was watching. Behind her, a man in a gray suit cleared his throat softly, shifting his carry-on forward an inch, while a young woman 2 places back lowered her phone just enough to glance over, curiosity flickering across her face before she quickly looked away again. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her gaze drifting for half a second toward the small black camera mounted in the upper corner of the counter, its red indicator light steady, recording everything without judgment, without interruption, and then back to Ethan. "Maybe the system needs a refresh," she said gently, her tone unchanged, as if offering him a way out, an opportunity to correct without confrontation. Ethan exhaled through his nose, the hint of impatience sharpening his posture now, fingers hovering above the keyboard but not yet moving, as though deciding whether the effort was worth it, his earlier amusement fading into something more rigid, more certain of itself, and the line behind. Naomi seemed to hold its breath again, the low murmur of the terminal continuing somewhere far off, disconnected from this small, tightening moment at counter B17 where judgment had already been made, and Naomi Carter, still standing there in her quiet composure, did not step back, did not raise her voice, did not defend herself. She simply waited, as if time itself were part of the answer. Naomi did not repeat herself immediately, and that small restraint carried more weight than any argument could have, her silence stretching just long enough to make the moment uncomfortable in a way Ethan did not expect, because most people in her position either rushed to explain or stepped aside, but she did neither. She simply stood there with a quiet steadiness that did not match the assumptions already forming in his mind. Her fingers relaxed slightly on the suitcase handle as she shifted her weight just enough to ease the pressure in her shoulders, the soft hum of the terminal wrapping around her like a distant current. And for a brief second her gaze drifted again, not out of distraction but awareness, tracing the polished floor, the reflection of travelers moving in parallel lines, the Flicker of departure times updating on a digital board 30 yards away. Each detail settling into place like pieces of a larger picture she was quietly assembling. It should be under Carter, she said again, slower this time. Each word placed carefully, not to correct him, but to ensure clarity, and there was a subtle confidence beneath her tone, something grounded, something that did not bend under pressure, though it remained gentle enough to avoid confrontation. Ethan leaned forward now, the earlier amusement thinning into impatience, his chair creaking softly as he reached for the keyboard, fingers hovering before finally pressing down with a sharper rhythm than before, as if the act itself annoyed him, the screen casting a pale blue glow across his face, highlighting the slight tightening in his jaw as he typed, then paused, then typed again, each keystroke carrying more force than necessary. Behind Naomi, the line shifted once more, a suitcase while clicking unevenly against the tile, a child somewhere to the left asking a question too quietly to hear. The world continuing its motion while this small interaction held its own gravity. Naomi's eyes remained on Ethan, but her attention seemed broader than that, as if she were listening to everything at once, the tone of his voice, the pace of his movements, the way he avoided eye contact now, focusing instead on the screen as though it could confirm what he had already decided. "Nothing is coming up," he said after a moment, his voice flatter, less performative, but still edged with dismissal. "Maybe you booked through a third party that did not go through." And he gave a short shrug, the kind that closed a conversation, rather than opened it. Naomi nodded once, not in agreement but acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, though there was a slight narrowing in her eyes now, not frustration, but concentration, as if aligning a thought she had been holding back, and then she spoke again. "Could you check the International Business Registry connected to the reservation?" The request was specific, precise in a way that did not match the role he had assigned to her. And for the first time, Ethan hesitated, just a fraction of a second, his fingers pausing above the keys as if the phrasing had caught him off guard. He glanced up at her, really looked this time, noticing perhaps the calm in her posture, the absence of urgency, the way she was not asking to be accommodated but expecting the process to be followed correctly, and something in that steadiness made the space between them shift slightly, though he quickly masked it with a small scoff. "That is not necessary," he replied, a bit too quickly. "Our system is standard across all bookings." But his voice lacked the earlier confidence, the certainty now thinner, stretched over a growing doubt he had not yet acknowledged. Naomi did not argue, did not press. She simply let the words settle, her gaze moving once more, briefly, to the corner camera, then to the badge clipped to his uniform, reading the name she had already heard, Ethan Cole, committing it quietly to memory, not out of spite, but as part of the same careful observation she had carried since the moment she stepped into line, and then back to him, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, waiting not for permission, but for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. The hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by Naomi, and not by the quiet shift that seemed to ripple through the space between them, subtle but undeniable, like a change in pressure before a storm. And though Ethan tried to maintain the same posture, the same dismissive tone, something in his movements had already slowed, his confidence no longer flowing as easily as before. He cleared his throat, a small, almost unconscious action, then leaned back slightly as if to regain control of the interaction. But the rhythm had changed, and even the faint tapping of his fingers against the counter felt less certain now. Naomi remained still, her presence steady, her breathing calm, the soft hum of the airport continuing around them, a boarding call echoing overhead, the distant roll of luggage wheels blending into a constant, low sound that made the silence at the counter feel even more defined, more contained, as if the moment had been isolated from everything else. "If it is not in your system," she said gently, her voice carrying that same quiet precision, "then it may be in the executive reservation channel." And the specificity of her words landed differently this time, not as a suggestion, but as knowledge, something that did not ask to be believed, only acknowledged. Ethan frowned slightly, the crease forming between his brows as he glanced back at the screen, then at her, and for a brief second, the assumption that had guided his behavior began to fracture, not completely, not Enough to change his stance, but enough to introduce doubt, the kind that lingers just beneath the surface, waiting to be confirmed or dismissed. "We do not have access to that here," he replied, though his voice lacked the firmness it had earlier, the statement sounding more like a defense than a fact, and he quickly added, "That is handled by corporate," as if the word itself would close the gap, create a boundary she could not cross. Naomi nodded once, her expression unchanged, but there was a faint shift in her eyes now, a recognition, as if she had reached the point she had been expecting, the limit of his knowledge, the edge of his authority, and she did not challenge it, did not push against it. She simply allowed it to exist. Behind her, the man in the gray suit checked his watch, the motion sharp, impatient, while a soft murmur passed through the line, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal that time was moving, that people were waiting, that this moment could not stretch indefinitely. Yet Naomi did not rush, did not step aside, her stillness anchoring the space in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. Her gaze moved once more, briefly, to the counter beside them, where another clerk processed a passenger with quick efficiency, scanning a passport, printing a boarding pass, offering a practiced smile, the contrast subtle but present, and then back to Ethan, whose fingers now hovered again above the keyboard, not typing, not resting, caught in a pause that seemed longer than it should have been. "Then perhaps," Naomi said, her voice soft but clear, "you could call someone who does." And there was no accusation in her tone, no challenge, just a simple statement that carried its own weight, because it was reasonable, because it was correct, and because it left him with a choice he had not anticipated, one that required more than dismissal. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, his eyes flicking once more to the screen, then to the small line of people behind her, then back to Naomi. And in that brief sequence, something shifted again, the realization, still incomplete, still forming, that this interaction was not as simple as he had first believed, that the person standing in front of him did not fit the role he had assigned, and that the system he trusted to confirm his assumptions might not be as definitive as he wanted it to be. And yet, even with that growing uncertainty, he hesitated, caught between maintaining control and acknowledging the possibility that he might already be wrong. The suggestion did not disappear into the air the way his earlier dismissal had. It lingered, pressing quietly against Ethan's next move, and for the first time since the exchange began, he did not respond immediately, his eyes shifting to the side where a small internal phone sat near the edge of the counter, its coiled cord resting in a loose loop, untouched, as if it belonged to a decision he was not yet ready to make. He straightened in his chair, forcing a small exhale that sounded more like irritation than thought, then leaned forward again, fingers returning to the keyboard with renewed intent, as though doubling down on the system would somehow restore the certainty he had lost. And the keys clicked faster now, sharper, the screen reflecting faintly in his eyes as he navigated through menus, tabs, and fields that he had skipped before. Naomi did not interrupt, did not repeat her request. She simply watched, her posture unchanged, her stillness now carrying a quiet patience that contrasted with his increasing urgency. And though she said nothing, there was a subtle shift in her gaze, not fixed on him alone, but moving again across the counter, the small details others ignored, the worn edge of the desk, the printed policy sheet taped just below eye level, the camera still recording from above, its presence constant, impartial. "There is nothing here," Ethan said again, but this time his voice lacked the earlier edge, the words sounding thinner, stretched over the effort he had just made. And he tapped the screen lightly, as if the gesture itself could reinforce his claim. No confirmation, no upgrade, nothing under that name. And yet even as he spoke, he avoided looking directly at her, his attention lingering on the display a fraction too long. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in consideration, her eyes narrowing just enough to suggest she was processing something beyond his words. And then she reached into her coat pocket with a calm, deliberate motion, retrieving her phone, its surface catching the overhead light for a brief moment before she unlocked it, her movements smooth, unhurried, as if she had anticipated this exact point in the conversation. The screen illuminated her face faintly, a soft glow reflecting in her eyes as she scrolled once, then stopped, her thumb resting lightly against the glass before she turned the device toward him, not pushing it across the counter, not insisting, simply offering it within his line of sight. "This is the confirmation I received," she said, her voice as steady as before, and the tone carried no accusation, only clarity, as if presenting a fact rather than defending a position. Ethan hesitated again, his gaze dropping to the screen, and for a brief second, the movement of the terminal seemed to fade around him, the distant announcements, the shifting line, the low conversations blending into a background he no longer fully registered, because what he saw did not align with what he had expected. The layout, the details, the level of access displayed on the phone were not typical, not something most passengers would have, and though he did not fully understand it, he recognized enough to feel the gap widening beneath his assumptions. He leaned in slightly, closer than before, his earlier confidence replaced by a cautious focus, and his lips parted as if to respond, but no immediate words came. Only a small pause that stretched just long enough to reveal uncertainty. Naomi did not fill the silence. She allowed it to settle, her hand steady as she held the phone, her expression unchanged, neither vindicated nor defensive, just present, waiting, while the quiet pressure of the moment built once more, not from confrontation, but from the simple fact that the narrative Ethan had constructed was beginning to unravel, piece by piece, in a way he could no longer easily dismiss. For a brief moment, Ethan did not speak at all, his eyes fixed on the phone in Naomi's hand, scanning the details again as if repetition might somehow simplify what he was seeing, but it did not. The interface was unfamiliar in its depth, layered with access points he did not recognize, codes and identifiers that did not belong to standard passenger bookings, and the more he looked, the more the certainty he had been holding onto slipped further out of reach. He straightened slowly, his chair shifting beneath him with a soft creak, and cleared his throat again, this time not out of impatience, but to fill the silence that had grown too noticeable, too heavy to ignore. This is not from our regular system," he said, his voice quieter now, lacking the earlier sharpness, and though he tried to maintain control of the situation, the words did not land with the same authority they once had. Instead, they carried a hint of uncertainty, as if he were explaining something to himself as much as to her. Naomi lowered the phone slightly, not withdrawing it completely, just enough to ease the tension in her arm, her gaze remaining steady on him, not pressing, not rushing, allowing him the space to process without interruption, and that absence of pressure made the moment stretch even further, because it left him alone with the realization forming in his mind. Behind her, the line had grown quieter, the earlier murmurs fading into a more focused stillness, several people now watching openly, their attention drawn not by volume, but by the shift in tone, the subtle change in control, and the way the interaction no longer followed the predictable pattern they had expected. Ethan glanced past Naomi for a second, noticing the eyes on him, the quiet observation, and then quickly looked back at the counter, his fingers hovering again over the keyboard before pulling back, as if he no longer trusted the system to give him the answer he needed. The phone on the desk, the one he had ignored earlier, now seemed closer, more present, its coiled cord no longer just an object, but a decision waiting to be made, and his gaze flicked toward it once, then away, then back again, the hesitation visible now, no longer hidden beneath confidence. "Where did you get this confirmation?" he asked finally, the question coming out slower than intended, each word measured, careful, as though he were stepping into unfamiliar territory. Naomi did not react to the shift in his tone, she simply answered. It was issued directly through the executive channel, her voice calm, consistent, carrying the same quiet certainty that had been there from the beginning, and she did not elaborate further, did not explain, because she did not need to. The information was already in front of him, already challenging everything he had assumed. Ethan nodded once, a small, almost involuntary motion, and then leaned forward again, this time not to assert control, but to reconsider, his eyes moving between the screen in front of him and the phone in her hand, as if trying to reconcile the two, to find a connection that would restore the order he understood, but the gap remained, wide, and unresolved. Another announcement echoed overhead, calling passengers to board a flight to Los Angeles, the voice crisp and detached, reminding everyone that time was still moving, that schedules continued regardless of individual moments. Yet here, at this counter, time felt suspended again, caught between what had been assumed and what was beginning to emerge. Ethan's hand moved slowly toward the desk phone, stopping just short of it, his fingers hovering above the receiver, the final hesitation before action. And in that small pause, the shift became undeniable. The balance of certainty had changed, and though no one had said it aloud, the realization was already there, waiting to be acknowledged. His fingers finally closed around the receiver, but instead of lifting it immediately, Ethan paused, the plastic cool against his skin, as if the weight of that small action had suddenly become heavier than expected, and for a brief second, he stared at it, his reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface of the counter beneath, distorted by the overhead lights that cast a pale, even glow across everything, flattening shadows, exposing details that might otherwise go unnoticed. Naomi lowered her phone completely now, letting her arm rest naturally at her side, the screen dimming as it locked, and with that motion, the last visible piece of evidence disappeared from view, leaving only the memory of it lingering in Ethan's mind, forcing him to rely not on what he could see, but on what he had already understood. The air between them shifted again, quieter this time, not tense in the way it had been before, but suspended, like a held breath that neither of them seemed in a hurry to release. Somewhere behind them, a suitcase zipper closed with a soft metallic sound, and a child laughed briefly before being hushed, the ordinary rhythm of the terminal continuing just out of reach, as if this moment existed slightly apart from it. Ethan exhaled slowly, a longer breath than before, and then, without looking directly at Naomi, he placed the receiver back down gently, not with dismissal, but with hesitation, as though the decision he had been about to make no longer felt sufficient, no longer matched the scale of what he was beginning to suspect. His hand lingered on the desk, fingers resting near the edge of the phone, and for the first time, there was no immediate attempt to speak, no quick explanation, only silence that stretched long enough to reveal the shift happening beneath it. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze no longer fixed on him alone, but drifting once more across the space, the reflections in the glass walls, the steady blink of the departure board, the quiet presence of people moving past without knowing what had just begun to unfold here. And in that stillness, there was no trace of urgency, no need to rush the outcome, as if she understood that the truth, once set in motion, did not require force to arrive. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers again, but this time without the earlier confidence, without the dismissive edge. Instead, there was a question there, unspoken but clear, not about the system, not about the reservation, but about her, about the gap between what he had assumed and what he could no longer ignore. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his posture as if trying to find a position that felt more certain, more grounded. But the movement only emphasized the uncertainty that had taken hold, his earlier ease, replaced by a careful awareness of every word, every gesture. "I will need to verify this," he said quietly, the statement no longer a barrier, but an admission, and even as he spoke, his eyes flicked once more toward the internal phone, then toward a small door behind the counter marked for staff access only, a space he had not considered using until now. Naomi gave a slight nod, not granting permission, but acknowledging the step, her expression calm, unchanged, as if this moment had always been part of the path forward, and she said nothing in response, allowing the silence to settle again, not heavy, not tense, but deliberate, giving space for the next move to be made without pressure, without performance. Ethan's hand moved again, this time not toward the phone, but toward the badge clipped to his uniform, his fingers brushing against it briefly before dropping back to the counter. And in that small, almost unconscious gesture, something shifted once more, a recognition not just of the situation, but of his own position within it. And for the first time since Naomi had stepped into the line, he seemed to understand that this was no longer about processing a ticket, but about something deeper, something that could not be corrected with a simple keystroke or dismissed with a practiced response. And as the overhead lights continued their steady glow and the distant announcements rolled on without pause, the moment at the counter held, quiet and unresolved, waiting for the truth to fully reveal itself. The shift did not announce itself with noise or urgency. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, carried in the measured footsteps of a woman approaching from behind the counter, her heels striking the polished floor in a steady rhythm that cut cleanly through the background hum of the terminal. And though no one had called for her out loud, her presence felt like an answer to something already unfolding. Ethan noticed her first, his posture straightening instinctively, his shoulders pulling back, as if guided by habit rather than thought, and the uncertainty that had been settling into his expression tightened into something more controlled, more formal, though it did not fully hide the tension beneath it. "Ms. Brooks," he said quickly, his voice shifting into a tone of professional deference, and the name carried just enough weight to draw a few more glances from the line behind Naomi, subtle but curious. Linda Brooks did not respond immediately, her gaze moving past Ethan before, settling on Naomi. And in that single moment, something changed, not in Naomi's posture, not in her expression, but in the way the space itself seemed to reorient, as if the roles that had been assumed were quietly rearranging themselves. Linda's steps slowed as she approached the counter, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition, not surprise, not confusion, but something more deliberate, something that suggested she had already connected the pieces before anyone else had spoken them aloud. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably precise, carrying a clarity that did not need to be raised to be heard. And the name hung in the air for a fraction longer than expected, long enough for Ethan to register it fully, long enough for the silence around them to deepen. Naomi inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement, nothing more, her expression unchanged, as if this moment had always been part of the sequence, as if nothing about it required adjustment. Ethan's gaze moved between them, the connection forming too quickly, too completely to ignore, and the certainty he had been holding on to finally gave way, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet, undeniable realization that settled heavily in his chest. Linda placed a folder on the counter, the soft sound of it meeting the surface cutting through the silence, and opened it with practiced ease, revealing documents that Ethan did not fully understand but immediately recognized as significant. The formatting, the seals, the level of detail all pointing to something far beyond a standard passenger record. "We have been expecting you," Linda continued, her attention still on Naomi, not even glancing at Ethan as she spoke, and the words carried a subtle shift in tone, one that acknowledged authority without needing to explain it. Ethan felt the weight of every assumption he had made pressing back against him now, each one clearer in hindsight, each one impossible to undo. And for a brief second, he opened his mouth as if to speak, to correct, to explain, but no words came, only the realization that anything he said would arrive too late, too small to matter. Naomi remained still, her presence steady, her gaze meeting Linda's without hesitation, and in that exchange, silent but complete, the truth settled fully into place, not announced, not emphasized, but understood. The line behind her had gone completely quiet now, the earlier impatience replaced by something else, something closer to awareness, as if everyone present had felt the shift even if they did not fully grasp its cause. Ethan's hands rested flat against the counter, his fingers no longer moving, no longer searching for control, and the screen in front of him, once the center of his certainty, now seemed irrelevant, a tool that had failed to capture the reality standing directly in front of him. Linda closed the folder with a soft, final motion, then finally turned her attention toward Ethan, her expression composed, but firm in a way that required no raised voice. And in that moment, the balance of the entire interaction became clear, not through confrontation, but through recognition, the kind that leaves no room for doubt, no space to return to what had been assumed before. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, as if every sound in the terminal had stepped back to make room for what needed to be understood, and Ethan stood there with his hands still resting against the counter, his posture no longer guarded but exposed in a way he could not correct, his earlier confidence replaced by a stillness that came from recognition rather than control. Linda's gaze remained on him for a moment longer, not harsh, not raised, but steady, the kind of attention that did not need to accuse because the truth was already present, already visible in the space between them. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same measured clarity. "We are in the middle of a service audit," she said, each word placed carefully, not to escalate, but to define the moment for exactly what it was. Ethan swallowed, a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to break the stillness around him, and his eyes shifted again, briefly, toward Naomi, as if searching for something in her expression, a reaction, a sign, anything that might lessen the weight settling in his chest. But there was none, only that same calm presence, unchanged, unaffected by the shift in recognition. Linda continued, her tone even. "Ms. Carter has been reviewing multiple service points across this terminal." And as she spoke, the pieces aligned fully, the earlier request, the precision in Naomi's words, the quiet observation, the absence of urgency, all of it forming a pattern that Ethan could now see clearly, though too late to change how he had responded. A faint sound of a boarding announcement echoed again overhead, the words indistinct but familiar, a reminder that the world outside this moment was still moving forward, still operating on schedules and procedures, while here, something more personal had already taken place. Ethan straightened slightly, the movement subtle, as if trying to reclaim a sense of professionalism, but his hands remained still, no longer reaching for the keyboard, no longer attempting to fix what had already been done. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its earlier edge. "I did not realize," he said, the sentence trailing slightly at the end, incomplete in a way that revealed more than any full explanation could have. Naomi looked at him then, fully, her gaze steady, not cold, not distant, but clear, and in that moment, the difference between them was not power, not status, but presence, the way she stood without needing to defend herself, without needing to raise her voice, and it was that contrast, more than anything else, that settled into the space between them. "That is the point," she said softly, her voice calm, carrying no anger, no emphasis, just truth, and the words landed without resistance, because they did not accuse, they revealed. Ethan nodded once, slowly, the motion small but sincere, his eyes lowering for a brief second before lifting again, and the shift in him was no longer subtle. It was visible now, in the way he held himself, in the way his voice had changed, in the way the certainty had been replaced by something quieter, something more aware. Linda closed the space with a final, measured tone. "Respect is not conditional," she said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a firmness that did not need to be repeated. And then she turned slightly, her attention returning to Naomi. "Your boarding has been arranged," she added, her voice softening just enough to mark the transition, the resolution already in motion. Naomi gave a small nod, acknowledging without drawing attention, her hand moving once more to the handle of her suitcase, the familiar weight grounding the moment, and without another word, she turned slightly toward the direction of the gate, her steps unhurried, her presence unchanged, leaving behind not tension, not conflict, but something quieter, something that lingered in the space she had just occupied. Ethan remained where he was, the counter in front of him, the screen still lit, the phone untouched, and for the first time since the interaction began, there was nothing left for him to process, nothing left to correct, only the understanding of what had already been revealed, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any response he could have given. Naomi's footsteps blended seamlessly into the rhythm of the terminal, soft and unhurried, the faint roll of her suitcase wheels tracing a steady path across the polished floor as she moved toward the gate. And with each step, the space she left behind seemed to settle into a quiet stillness, not empty, but reflective, as if something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The overhead lights continued their steady glow, casting long reflections across the glass walls, and the departure board flickered with updated times, indifferent to the moment that had just unfolded, yet somehow holding it within the same space. Ethan remained at the counter, his posture unchanged, his hands still resting where they had been, But everything about him felt different now. The sharp certainty that had once defined his movements replaced by a quiet awareness that lingered beneath the surface. And though no one spoke directly to him, the presence of others nearby carried a subtle weight, not judgment, not confrontation, but recognition, the kind that comes from witnessing something real. He glanced once toward the direction Naomi had gone, his eyes following the line of travelers moving toward security, and for a brief second, he caught a glimpse of her again, her figure steady, composed, disappearing gradually into the flow of people, not standing out, not demanding attention, yet leaving behind an impression that felt larger than the moment itself. Behind the counter, the screen in front of him remained lit, the system still open to the same page, unchanged, waiting for input that no longer seemed urgent, and the phone beside it sat untouched, its coiled cord resting exactly where it had been, a silent reminder of the choice he had hesitated to make. Linda stood nearby for a moment longer, her presence calm, her expression unreadable but steady, and then she turned slightly, her attention shifting away as she moved toward another part of the terminal, her role in the moment complete, leaving Ethan alone with the quiet aftermath. The line behind him began to move again, slowly at first, then with the familiar rhythm of routine returning, a passenger stepping forward, placing a bag on the scale, speaking softly, continuing the process that had been interrupted, and Ethan responded, his voice measured, his movements more deliberate now, each action carrying a subtle change, a careful attention that had not been there before. The announcements overhead continued, calling flights, guiding travelers, filling the space with a constant, neutral sound, and yet beneath it, something remained, something that did not fade as quickly, the memory of a moment where assumption met reality and was quietly undone. Across the terminal, beyond the glass and the shifting lines, Naomi reached the gate, her boarding